Right now, the dominant narrative is that inflation is spiking because of the conflict in the Middle East. It is a clean story with a simple cause and effect that is very easy to digest on the evening news. But there is a massive flaw in that story. The Federal Reserve doesn't actually use the inflation numbers you see in those headlines. They keep their own internal scoreboard, targeting a 2% rate measured by a metric called Personal Consumption Expenditures, or the PCE. This chart shows the Federal Reserve's actual inflation timeline compared to the headlines. The geopolitical conflict in the Middle East started just 5 months ago, but the Fed has missed its internal inflation target for 63 months in a row. That's 5 straight years of failure. The PCE sits at over 4%, double the Fed's target limit, and that line is continuing to climb. Diagnosing a 5-year structural economic problem using a 5-month-old news story leaves the public blind to the actual forces quietly draining the cash in their wallets. For a long time, inflation in this country felt practically non-existent. From 1985 to 2007, growth was steady, prices were stable, and the whole system looked like it ran on autopilot. Economists even called this era the Great Moderation. But there was no invisible hand guiding the market. There was a very real one. The economy acted like a pendulum, and every time it swung too far out of line, an entity was standing right beside it, giving it a firm push back toward the middle. That entity is the Federal Reserve. They pushed the pendulum so reliably for decades that we forgot it was being pushed at all. But today, the institution doing the pushing is structurally broken. Understanding why this specific tool failed is the only way to accurately predict why the cost of your groceries, gas, and housing will keep going up. Let's look back to 1979. Inflation was sprinting at over 13.5%. The dollar was actively rotting in people's pockets. Enter Federal Reserve Chair Paul Volcker. Volcker did what nobody else had the stomach for. He deliberately triggered 2 back-to-back recessions by driving interest rates up to 20%. He strangled the money supply until inflation had nothing left to feed on. And it worked. So if that brutal playbook worked for Volcker in the 80s, why can't the current Fed chair, Jerome Powell, simply do the exact same thing today? Because Volcker had an advantage that no one talks about. The country could absorb the damage of higher rates because the total national debt was a fraction of the overall economy. This chart compares the national debt loads of the two eras. When Volcker took over, the debt sat at about 25% of GDP. Today, that number is closing in on 100%, a near one-to-one match with the entire American economy. When the Federal Reserve raises rates at this level of debt, it presses down in 2 places at once. It hits the brakes on consumer borrowing, slowing down the economy, but it simultaneously hits the gas on government spending.
Higher rates mean the government is suddenly forced to pay massive interest checks to bondholders, pension funds, and foreign governments. That money doesn't just vanish. It lands in their accounts and gets spent, injecting billions of fresh dollars right back into the system. The sheer weight of the national debt has inverted the Fed's primary weapon. One foot presses the brake, the other floors the accelerator. The mechanism that is supposed to fight inflation is now fueling it. In 1981, economists Thomas Sargent and Neil Wallace published a paper predicting exactly this. They warned that if a government constantly runs deficits, the central bank cannot destroy inflation. It can only postpone it. You don't have to take a 40-year-old paper's word for it. You can see it happening right now by looking at the M2 money supply, the metric that tracks all the physical cash and easily accessible money sloshing around the economy. This chart tracks the M2 money supply. For about 3 years, the Fed ran a policy called quantitative tightening, draining money out of the system. But they hit a limit. If they drained any more cash, the banking system would have seized up. To prevent a collapse, they recently turned the money pumps back on, spiking the supply by $40 billion a month. The Fed reached a point where they had to choose between preventing a systemic financial break or stopping inflation. By refilling the money supply to keep banks functional, they are effectively choosing to let inflation run hot. Lawmakers down the street control the budget, leaving the Federal Reserve to manage the symptoms of their spending. The Congressional Budget Office estimates the annual deficit for this fiscal year will reach $1.4 trillion. That is nearly 6% of the entire economy, blowing far past the historical average. This chart of government tax revenue highlights the most alarming metric of all. Right now, interest payments alone consume 19 cents of every tax dollar collected. We now spend more money just paying interest on our debt than we spend on the entire military budget. This crisis has escalated beyond the Federal Reserve's control. It is a compounding mathematical snowball. The more we borrow, the more interest we owe, and the more interest we owe, the more we have to borrow just to pay it. Inflation persists because our political system rewards spending and punishes fiscal responsibility. Both political parties do it because nobody builds a successful career in Congress by promising the public less. A few years ago, Warren Buffett was asked how he would fix this. His solution was simple: pass a law that legally bars any sitting member of Congress from re-election if the national deficit ever runs past 3% of GDP. He was laughing when he said it, but he was completely right. Until the incentives driving government spending are forcibly changed, the inflation trap will only tighten. And all those headlines telling you the economy is cooling down, they are just a distraction from the reality of the math.